Good afternoon. Welcome to Cool Springs. Today is Wednesday, November the 12th, 2025, and this is our series, Heroes and Heroines of the Church. And for the month of November, we're trying to focus, because of the Thanksgiving season, on either events involving the pilgrims who came to the New World seeking religious freedom, or events surrounding the Revolutionary War, where after having been under British rule from the 1620s until the 1770s, things had gotten to where there was such a strain in the relationship between the colonies in America and the king. We're going to talk about a couple of people in the Revolutionary War, because a lot of folks know about 1776 and the Declaration of Independence that was actually done by the Continental Congress on July 2nd, but publicly published and proclaimed on July the 4th, particularly since next year, 2026, will be the 250th anniversary of America's independence as a nation. So a lot of people are starting to make plans for how can we acknowledge our history, our freedom, and celebrate what people in our country 250 years ago did to secure our rights today. And so a lot of people think about that 1776, but they don't really realize that really the seeds of the Revolutionary War go back at least another 12 or 13 years to roughly 1763, when the British were imposing more and more taxes and trying to restrict people's liberties incrementally, and it was starting to cause dissension, and people were beginning to think we need to try to get the king's attention and see if we can get redress to these grievances. And then when that didn't work, some were starting to do open acts of rebellion. So you had people each of the colonies sending emissaries, ambassadors if you would, to the king to try to say, look, here's what your policy is, and here's how it's doing harm to us. They were trying to be respectful. They were trying to keep the relationship together. They weren't trying to be disloyal to the British crown. But the king wasn't listening. And the more they sought relief, the more he dug in and the harsher he made conditions. That's why you have things like the Boston Tea Party, where the tea was being shipped in and Britain was demanding that people buy it whether they wanted it or not, and have to pay enormous prices for it. So some of the colonists dressed up, pretending to be natives, tossing all the tea into the harbor, because as long as it's on the ship, it's not taxable yet. But the minute they offload it onto the wharf, now they're stuck with it. So you had about a 13-year period where the more they tried to reason with and get the king to compromise and make their lives more bearable, and the less he listened, the more the relationship deteriorated. By 1775, the year officially before the Revolutionary War broke out, things had gotten to the point where the king kept sending more and more troops from Britain to come over here and prop up the colonial governors that he had appointed and to crack down on the populace. And so in 1775, in April of 1775, you had the famous Battle of Lexington and Concord, where nobody still to this day knows who fired the first shot that set into motion what would later become the Revolutionary War. But there was a young minister in his late 20s, early 30s, who was there as a pastor to the local congregation in Concord. In fact, his house was very close to where that bridge at Concord, where the battle took place, occurred. And historians argue about whether the minister in question, his name was Reverend William Emerson, was actually there with the Minutemen, bearing arms himself and fighting off the British or whether he was at his home, but he had some detailed historical accounts that cause historians to wonder, how could he have this much detail unless he was there? And when the Continental Congress formed to try to get the colonies to start acting as one unit rather than Massachusetts having their beef with the Crown and Rhode Island having its own beef, or New York or South Carolina or any of the other colonies, that they were trying to act as a unified force. When the Continental Congress decided we need to get together, they appointed George Washington, who had been previously a major fighting with the British during the French and Indian Wars several years before. They named him the commanding general of the Continental Army. And the first thing that George Washington asked for when he accepted the appointment as the commanding general was he told the Continental Congress, I want you to authorize the recruiting of ministers of the gospel to be chaplains to go with the fighting men to provide spiritual comfort and spiritual hope to those troops who are bearing arms. And William Emerson, who was present there and encouraging the locals during the battles of Lexington and Concord, was the very first person appointed to be a chaplain in what would eventually become the United States Army. It was the Continental Army at the time. He didn't get to serve as a chaplain for very long. He went with the troops. He had a wife and young children at home. But in a matter of a few months' time, he became very, very ill with dysentery, and they had to send him home for health reasons, but he never made it all the way back home. He actually died on the way being sent home because of his illness. But ministers were important during that Revolutionary War and that period of about 13 years that led up to the Revolutionary War, proclaiming from the pulpit either support for Great Britain and the king's right to rule over people, or supporting the idea that based on the Bible, God's intention is that all men should be free to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience, and therefore should be able to govern themselves. And a lot of the men who wound up being appointed as chaplains in that Continental Army, Emerson was just the first. A lot of those men who were appointed as chaplains were proclaiming in pulpits the need for people to rally to the American cause, and they were using the Bible as their basis for encouraging the men of their congregation to be willing to take up arms, to fight for their freedom, to defend their families' rights, to be able to live in this world and not have to pay taxes to somebody who wasn't listening to them across thousands of miles of ocean, and to be able to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. One of the most famous men who became a chaplain was a fellow by the name of Peter Muhlenberg. He was in Virginia, and the colony of Virginia was officially an Anglican, you would think of today as the Episcopal Church, colony. Rhode Island was an independent colony. People could worship the way they wanted to. So Roger Williams had moved from Congregationalist Massachusetts to Rhode Island and founded the first Baptist church in America. So you've got your Congregationalists in Massachusetts, you've got your Baptists and others in Rhode Island, you've got the Anglicans in Virginia, and you have a lot of Quakers in Pennsylvania, and just a whole variety of people from the Christian background who are being recruited as chaplains in the fledgling U.S. military. Peter Muhlenberg is famous because he was preaching in his pulpit one Sunday, and of course he had on the black ministerial robes that people of liturgical churches will often wear, and he preached a very fiery sermon about the fact that there's a time for praying and there's a time for fighting, and the time for fighting is now. And he encouraged all the men in his congregation who were able-bodied and of fighting age to follow me. And then he took off his ministerial robe, and underneath it he had on the military uniform of a colonel in the Virginia militia because he had already signed up to be a member of the militia, and now he's encouraging every able-bodied man in his congregation to come and fight on the side of the colonists in the Revolutionary War. And to their credit, all the men who were of fighting age did so. So these people were important in not only encouraging the troops and seeing to their spiritual needs while they're suffering through the hardships that go along with being deployed and away from your families, but they were also instrumental, even the ones who didn't join the Continental Army as chaplains, in encouraging the folks back home to support the cause of liberty, to be willing to give up some of their produce and some of their funds to help pay for others to go and fight, and to be able to basically keep the home fires burning. And they did so out of a conviction that, based on their understanding of God's Word, the Bible, that it was important for people to be able to have the freedom to choose to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. When you look at our founding documents, you'll see that they are replete with references to the fact that God is the creator, that there is a supreme being, that there is a supreme lawgiver, and that all of the rights of human beings flow not from some government initiated by man, but from God himself. And so because of their sincere belief in what they saw as their God-given right to form their own country, to where they could choose to worship in whatever way they chose to worship, or be free to not worship God without having to have someone else dictate to them how they should live. So they're an important part of our American history and an important part of our understanding of this holiday that's coming up of Thanksgiving, and the one we just celebrated yesterday, Veterans Day, where we're honoring all those who have served in uniform in any part of our American history, to know that there are people who are willing to sacrifice being at home, being with their families, being comfortable, to go out and risk injury, risk death, to fight for a cause that's worth dying for so that others may live. Thanks for watching.